The cabin lights flickered as Flight 982 began to lose altitude. Passengers screamed, flight attendants exchanged panicked glances, but one woman sat perfectly still. Emily Carter, quiet in her seat, closed her eyes and began to assess the situation. She hadn't flown a plane in 6 years. Yet as chaos erupted at 30 feet, her body responded before her mind caught up, and something old and disciplined stirred beneath the surface. What happened next wasn't about showy heroics. It was a series of deliberate, almost invisible choices, each guided by training that most had long forgotten she ever possessed. In that moment, Emily's dormant skills rose to meet the crisis, setting in motion a story that began long before she ever boarded the plane. On Flight 982, Emily Carter blended into the crowd. She moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, stowing her backpack, settling into her seat, and glancing once at the wing's edge before buckling her belt. To anyone watching, she was just another traveler, her quiet presence unremarkable, her gaze steady and unreadable. 6 years had passed since she last sat at a set of flight controls. The Air Force Academy, the cockpit drills, and the relentless pressure of military aviation belonged to a previous chapter she'd closed with intention. Emily had left that world for the stability of software development, seeking a life where risk was measured in lines of code, not in engine failures at altitude. She preferred the anonymity of civilian routine, where her responsibilities began and ended at her desk, and where the only decisions she faced were technical, not life or death. As the plane taxied, she watched the runway lights blur across the window. Old habits lingered in subtle ways. She noted the pitch of the engines during takeoff, the way the aircraft rolled into the climb. These were details she tried to ignore, fragments of a life she'd tucked away with her flight manuals and uniforms. She had become skilled at passing for ordinary, at letting the rhythms of everyday travel wash over her. The cabin around her hummed with the usual distractions, muted conversations, a child's persistent tapping on the seat back, the rustle of snack wrappers. Emily welcomed these sounds. They were reminders of the normalcy she'd worked hard to embrace, the kind of background noise that made her feel safely invisible. At her tech job in Seattle, her military past was little more than a line on a confidential HR file. She rarely spoke of it, even to herself. But some instincts resisted neglect. As the plane leveled off above the clouds, Emily's body registered faint shifts in vibration, subtle changes in engine resonance signals most passengers would never notice. When the first pocket of turbulence hit, her hands pressed flat to her thighs, and her feet braced unconsciously against the floor, as if searching for rudder pedals that weren't there. The motions were automatic, muscle memory surfacing before her thoughts could catch up. Research from a 2018 Johns Hopkins study found that procedural memory, the kind required for complex tasks like flying, can persist for years, even after long periods of disuse. The brain and body, when trained under stress, remember what to do. For Emily, this meant her skills had not vanished. They had merely gone quiet, waiting for the right stimulus to bring them back online. She tried to dismiss the sensations, an odd pitch in the engine's whine, a vibration that felt out of place, but her mind logged each detail. She noticed the flight attendant's slight pause before speaking, the way the plane listed gently to one side after the turbulence passed. Even the faint scent of overheated electronics seemed to cut through the recycled air, sharp and unmistakable. While others responded with nervous chatter or tightened grips on armrests, Emily's attention sharpened. She catalogued every anomaly, her thoughts shifting from civilian complacency to a quiet, analytic vigilance. The training she'd tried to leave behind was asserting itself, not as panic, but as readiness's silent recalibration that set her apart from the rest of the cabin. As the aircraft continued on course, the atmosphere in the cabin remained deceptively calm. But for Emily, the signals were building. Each vibration, each irregular sound, each subtle cue hinted at something beneath the surface, something her instincts could not ignore. The moment would soon come when these observations would demand more than silent attention. The first tremor barely drew notice from the passengers. It was the sort of fleeting vibration that commercial jets often absorb without incident. But Emily felt her shoulders lock before the seatbelt sign illuminated overhead. Her body registered the difference. This wasn't the familiar jostle of turbulence, but a harsher, uneven rhythm that signaled mechanical stress. Around her, people shifted in their seats, or glanced up, unconcerned. Emily's hand drifted to the armrest, fingertips pressing lightly as she tuned in to the subtle changes beneath her. She didn't count or analyze in words. Her nervous system simply recognized the pattern, the offbeat thrum that marked something out of balance. Her training had conditioned her to notice what others missed how. The vibrations now seemed more urgent, the engine's tone slightly strained. A deeper vibration ran through the fuselage, distinct from the background hum. The left engine's whine took on a rougher edge, the pitch just off enough to raise the hairs on Emily's arms. Her senses sharpened, drawing a line between the usual and the abnormal. These details didn't announce themselves loudly, but to someone who'd spent years in cockpits, they were as clear as warning lights. Across the aisle, a passenger gripped his cup as water sloshed out. Emily noted the subtle tilt of the cabin plane was listing, not just shaking. Flight attendants moved with practiced calm, but Emily caught the small delays, the way the lead attendant lingered at the intercom, the younger crew member's eyes darting toward the cockpit. Their composure held, but the cracks were visible to anyone who knew where to look. Military pilot training sharpens the senses for moments like this. Cadets learn to read the aircraft's language, to detect the faintest cues of trouble. Emily's mind cataloged each sound and sensation vibrations through the seat, the uneven whine of the engine, a faint metallic creak near the wing root. She didn't need to name each anomaly. Her instincts sorted them automatically, flagging the situation as abnormal and escalating. Then the second jolt hit, far stronger than the first. The overhead bins rattled, and the cabin filled with startled voices. Emily stayed still, drawing a slow breath through parted lips. A new smell cut through the recycled air-burnt wiring, sharp and metallic. She knew that scent. Electrical failure, likely forward of the cabin. The odor confirmed what her body already suspected. As the noise in the cabin swelled cries, questions, a child's frightened sob, Emily's focus narrowed. She imagined the cockpit, the captain's hands fighting unresponsive controls, the aircraft systems straining to compensate. Her own hands flexed in her lap, muscle memory recalling the feel of a yoke gone stiff. She watched through her window as the left aileron jerked instead of gliding, a sign that control surfaces were losing integrity. The flight attendant's voice came over the speakers, steady but thin. "We're experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated." Emily caught the hesitation, the careful choice of words. This was not routine. The mask of reassurance had slipped. Each passenger felt the shaking, but Emily alone translated the signals into meaning. FAA reports would later show that Flight 982 suffered simultaneous failures in 2 redundant systems, a rare, near-impossible scenario. But in this moment, Emily didn't think in statistics. She ran through emergency protocols in her mind, steps she hadn't needed in years. Confirm hydraulic pressure, stabilize pitch, prepare for rapid descent. The checklist surfaced as naturally as breathing. A sudden metallic shriek cut through the cabin. The left engine's whine climbed, sharper and higher. Through her window, Emily saw orange flickers curling from the engine housing, not an explosion but unmistakable fire. The sight snapped her fully into action. Instinct replaced hesitation. All around her, panic grew. The cabin lights flickered, voices rose, and the sense of order dissolved. Emily remained still, her thoughts clear and deliberate. She listened for the next cue, bracing for what would come next as the situation shifted from uncertainty to crisis. The oxygen masks dropped with a mechanical hiss. Emily watched hers swing for a half-second before pulling it down and fitting it in place. The sharp plastic smell brought back flashes of Academy emergency drillshire hands moving with practiced efficiency as the cabin erupted into confusion. Around her, passengers struggled with tangled straps and rising panic. She moved automatically, securing her mask, her mind narrowing to the task in front of her. A commotion at the front caught her attention. The cockpit door cracked open and a flight attendant stumbled out, gripping the wall for support. The woman's face was drained of color, except for 2 red patches on her cheeks. It was the look of someone barely holding together under pressure. Emily unbuckled and rose, her decision already made. The instinct to help, dormant for years, Serge Dupin's old sense of duty snapping awake. The aisle was a tangle of frightened passengers. A man stood frozen, his mask hanging uselessly from one ear. A mother clutched her children close, rocking them as she wept. Emily navigated through the chaos, her movements calm and deliberate, until she reached the attendant. Up close, she saw the woman's chest rising quickly, pupils wide with adrenaline. Not quite shock, but close. Emily kept her voice low, steady. "What's happening up there?" The attendant blinked, struggling to focus. "Co-pilot's down." The words were thin, barely rising above the engine's uneven drone. "Captain needs—" Another lurch from the plane cut her off. Emily braced them both against a seatback, her mind already racing ahead. She knew the captain could request expert help, but only he could clear her for the cockpit. The rules were clear, but the urgency was clearer. "I'm former Air Force flight training," Emily said, keeping her tone factual. "Tell the captain I can assist." It wasn't bravado, just a statement of fact. The attendant's eyes searched hers, looking for something solid to trust. Whatever she saw was enough. She nodded and turned back toward the cockpit. Through the gap in the door, Emily glimpsed the co-pilot slumped in his harness, oxygen mask in place, but hands limp. Even from a distance, she recognized the sign's faint pulse, shallow breathing. Pressure-induced fainting, maybe exacerbated by dehydration or something hidden. The captain was forced to divide his focus, one hand on the yoke, the other trying to check his colleague's vitals. It was a losing battle. The attendant returned quickly. "He says get up there. No time for protocol or paperwork, just a desperate need for help." Emily stepped forward, her mind shifting into the old patterns she thought she'd left behind. Cases where civilians step into the cockpit during a crisis are rare, only a handful in decades. Each one required someone to recognize the moment and act. Emily crossed that threshold as she entered the cockpit, sliding into the co-pilot's seat and letting her hands settle on the controls. She didn't take command. Her first priority was assessment. The stick felt heavy, hydraulic pressure dropping, rudder slow to respond. Engine 2's temperature was well into the danger zone. The captain, face drawn and collar damp with sweat, nodded toward the unconscious co-pilot. Emily reached over, checking the man's pulse thready, but there, breathing was shallow. Pulse present, breathing weak. "Most likely vasovagal," she reported quietly. The words came back easily, as if she'd never left the flight line. The captain's response was a quick nod, his attention locked on keeping the plane level as turbulence worsened. Modern jets are built for redundancy, but when multiple systems fail, priorities shift fast. Emily's experience let her cut through the chaos, scanning the instruments for the most urgent threats. She adjusted the co-pilot's head to open his airway, then returned to the controls, fingers finding the trim wheel out of habit. The nose had started to drift up a dangerous angle given their engine problems. She eased it down, making small, careful corrections. The captain glanced at her, not quite with relief, but with recognition. In that moment, they weren't strangers. They were both crew, working together in crisis. Outside the cockpit, the sky bucked and shuddered. Inside, Emily Carter did what she'd trained for. Not heroics, not bravado, just steady, informed action, every movement focused on keeping the aircraft flying. Inside the cockpit, Emily focused on the immediate demands of flight, stepping into a role that required presence, not authority. She didn't take command, she simply started working, her actions shaped by necessity and training. The air was thick with tension, the captain's jaw clenched as he juggled the yoke and a glance at his unconscious co-pilot. Emily's first check was practical. 2 fingers to the co-pilot's neck, confirming a pulse, then a quick adjustment to open his airway. She kept her movements efficient, eyes tracking the instrument panel, mind sorting priority screw first, then aircraft. The captain spoke in short, clipped updates, his focus split between the controls and the crisis. Hydraulics at 40%. Emily nodded, her hand already finding the trim wheel. The nose had crept upward, risking a dangerous loss of speed. She dialed in nose-down trim, inch by inch, feeling the resistance and adjusting until the climb stabilized. In these moments, the aircraft's advanced systems offered little help. Manual corrections mattered most, and Emily's muscle memory guided her through each adjustment. Her hands moved constantly small, precise corrections to throttle, rudder, and trim, each one countering the instability creeping into the plane's movements. These weren't dramatic gestures, but they kept the jet steady, buying time as the situation unfolded. She watched the captain's hands, mirroring his inputs without overstepping, responding to his cues and smoothing out his overcorrections during turbulence. Their coordination was wordless, but effective, a partnership built in crisis, not hierarchy. "Flaps?" Emily asked, keeping her tone level. The captain shook his head, signaling the risk of added drag with their uneven thrust. She accepted the decision, her fingers moving to the alternate gear lever in silent preparation. The cockpit required constant attention, every system a potential liability. She toggled switches on the overhead panel, rerouting electrical power to emergency backups, shifting fuel pumps, dimming the lights as systems reallocated. None of these steps solved the core problems, but each one slowed the pace of failure, buying a few more crucial minutes. The radio crackled with questions from approach control, but Emily's priority stayed with the aircraft. She kept a thumb near the autopilot disconnect, ready to intervene if the system faltered. Every vibration through the seat, every sound from the engines, told her something about the plane's condition: a high-frequency shudder from the left engine, a low rumble underfoot from the hydraulics. She didn't dwell on the details, she just responded, each action guided by years of training. She caught the first hint of Dutch rolla, subtle, rhythmic sway before the warning even lit up. Without a word, she pressed the rudder pedals, countering the motion with measured pressure. The timing had to be exact, too early or too late, and the oscillation would worsen. Her focus narrowed to the essentials. Keep the wings level, the nose steady, the descent controlled. Daylight flickered through the clouds, the horizon shifting outside the windshield. Emily's eyes moved between the instruments and the world beyond, balancing data with instinct. She remembered a lesson from her academy days. Fly the airplane, not the panel. It was a reminder to trust her senses as much as the gauges. When the captain finally released the yoke to check on his co-pilot, Emily eased her hands onto the controls, taking over without ceremony. The transition was seamless, no words, no acknowledgement, just the silent exchange of responsibility. The control column felt heavier than she remembered, the weight of the aircraft and the moment settling into her grip. She rerouted another system, then pressed the mic. Her voice was calm, clear, and direct as she contacted air traffic control. "Flight 980, 2, emergency, 2 crew, 1 incapacitated. Engine 2, unstable, standing by for vectors." The message was brief, but it cut through the static with certainty. The captain listened, offering a nod. Whether approval or fatigue, it didn't matter. The cockpit had found its rhythm. Behind them, the cabin remained tense, passengers unaware of the quiet, relentless work underway. There were no grand gestures, just a series of small, correct actions, each one extending their margin of safety. This was crisis management in its most practical form. The accumulation of steady decisions, manual corrections, and shared focus. The altimeter ticked downward, but the descent was stable. Flaps remained retracted, throttle settings balanced the need for power with the limits of the failing engine. Nothing about the situation was ideal, but it was manageable, what pilots called managed degradation, losing capabilities in stages while maintaining control. Emily had studied the concept. Now she lived it, each adjustment a choice to keep the plane flying. Amid the storm and failing systems, Emily glanced at the navigation display. The terrain ahead was unfamiliar, a patchwork of forest and mountain ridges stretching to the horizon. She didn't know what options lay ahead, but she prepared to find one. Mackenzie Ridge appeared as a faint gray scar in the dense green landscape, a relic of Cold War contingency planning, long abandoned and almost erased by time. Emily spotted it first on her display, the runway's faded outline barely visible against the surrounding forest. She called out its coordinates to the captain, voice even, offering facts instead of hope. The runway was short, rough, and lined with overgrown vegetation, but it ran nearly parallel to the prevailing wind. That single alignment, she noted aloud, gave them a fighting chance. There was no pretense about options. This was survival, not strategy. The captain's response was measured but heavy. No approach lights, no tower. Once we commit, there's no going back. He lingered over the chart, searching for an alternative that didn't exist. Emily waited, eyes on the instruments, letting the silence answer for both of them. They both understood the risk. A commercial jet on a strip meant for fighters, landing blind with no margin for error. She weighed the odds, calculating fuel burn, descent rate, and the angle of approach. The decision was not about finding the right answer, just the least catastrophic one. Air traffic control came through the headset, questioning their sudden change in heading. Emily kept her reply concise, confirming their intentions and relaying the airstrip's coordinates. The controller's tone shifted, the unease clear even through the static. No one expected a modern jet to divert to a forgotten runway. But Emily's focus never wavered. She watched the fuel gauge drop, recalculated their glide path, and prepared for a landing that would test every dormant skill she had. The first glimpse of Mackenzie Ridge through the clouds revealed its true state. The runway was a patchwork of cracked asphalt, brush creeping in from the sides, and a slope that would force them to land faster than safety recommended. Emily pointed out the wind's direction and the runway's orientation, her assessment clipped and pragmatic. "We'll have a tailwind on final. We need every foot." The captain nodded. The decision finally settled. There would be no further debate. As they descended, the plane systems continued to degrade. Hydraulics bled pressure, the left engine's temperature warning edging into red. Emily managed the power settings, making constant, precise adjustments to keep the asymmetrical thrust in check. Each movement was deliberate, conserving what little control remained. She kept her hand near the gear lever, ready for manual extension if the hydraulics failed completely. The aircraft felt heavier, responding slower to every input, but she worked through the checklist, methodical and unhurried. Approaching the valley, the strip came into full view. The surface was uneven, fissures running the length of the asphalt, and the outline of a rusted vehicle near the threshold. They would have to land long and brake hard, risking the remaining systems. Emily called for flaps at 20, monitoring the airspeed as it edged above the safe landing threshold. The approach would be steep, the margin for error reduced to almost nothing. Wind shear struck at 3.0 feet, dropping them abruptly. Emily compensated with throttle, her hands steady even as the turbulence threatened to shake them off course. The captain fought to keep the wings level, both pilots silent except for quick, necessary exchanges. The windsock, barely visible and battered, confirmed the crosswind. Emily relayed the information, her attention split between the instruments and the shrinking distance to the ground. At 500 feet, the details sharpened. Cracks in the pavement, brush encroaching on the runway's edge, the faint outline of an abandoned control tower. Emily called out altitudes, her voice a metronome for the captain's focus. The jet crossed the threshold too fast, the descent angle sharper than recommended. Emily's hand hovered near the thrust reversers, knowing their reliability was uncertain on such a surface. The wheels struck hard, the sound of compressed struts and groaning metal filling the cockpit. Reverse thrust responded only partially, but manual braking held. The runway blurred past, uneven ground jarring the cabin. Emily kept pressure on the brakes, measuring every foot as they slowed. The nose gear stopped just short of a deep fissure, the jet finally still. Silence settled, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Emily reached forward and shut down the remaining engine. There was no celebration, just the quiet aftermath of an imperfect solution, chosen because it was the only one left. She glanced at the instruments, then at the captain, both of them absorbing the outcome in a moment that felt suspended between crisis and relief. The process was not over. Systems still needed securing, the situation inside the cabin still demanded attention. For Emily, the work continued one step at a time, each action deliberate, every decision shaped by necessity rather than certainty. Landing a commercial jet on an abandoned strip is not a single decision or a dramatic maneuver, it is a process measured in split seconds and dozens of corrections. As the battered aircraft lined up with the cracked, narrow runway, Emily Carter's focus narrowed to the task of keeping the plane under control. The strip below looked barely adequate, its surface uneven and rimmed with brush, but it was the only option left. The approach demanded precision, not heroics. Emily handled the descent with methodical care. She managed the throttle, made constant fractional adjustments to the yoke, and nudged the rudder to counter the unpredictable crosswind. The plane's hydraulic systems responded sluggishly, so every input required more force and more attention. She watched the ground rise to meet them, calculating the closure rate and angle, aware that the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Wind shear hit just above the tree line, forcing a quick correction of many that would keep the aircraft aligned with the deteriorating centerline. At 50 feet, she began the flare early, easing the nose up to bleed off speed before touchdown. The left main gear struck first, hard enough to jolt everyone in their seats, then the right followed. The uneven surface sent a shudder through the cabin. Reverse thrust engaged, but the asymmetrical power from the failing engine pulled the aircraft left. Emily countered with rudder, keeping the jet pointed straight as the brakes took hold. She avoided slamming the pedals, instead applying steady, progressive pressure enough to slow them without risking a blowout on the rough, patched pavement. The runway blurred past, the abandoned control tower looming ahead as a silent witness. Emily kept her eyes on the diminishing markers, tracking their speed, not letting up until the aircraft rolled to a halt just short of a deep fissure. Only then did she allow herself a breath. The silence in the cockpit was immediate and sharp, broken only by the faint ticking of cooling metal and the sound of her own pulse. She moved through the shutdown checklist, automatically fuel pumps off, electrical systems reset, auxiliary power engaged. There was no celebration, no dramatic gesture, just the final steps of a process that had started long before the wheels hit the ground. Post-flight analysis would later show that dozens of tiny corrections, some barely perceptible, had kept the plane on track during those final seconds. Precision, not luck, had made the landing survivable. Outside, the world seemed to pause. Sunlight filtered through the trees, catching on the warped metal and the grass sprouting through the tarmac. The sense of completion felt muted, almost unreal, after the relentless focus of the descent. Emily's muscles ached from tension she hadn't noticed until now. The captain exhaled, shoulders sagging, but neither spoke. The work was not truly finished until the passengers were safe. From the cabin, a faint sound drifted forward, a child's voice, hushed and uncertain. "Are we on the ground?" It cut through the quiet, grounding the moment in reality. The relief and confusion mingled behind the locked cockpit door, the human cost of the ordeal surfacing in small private reactions. The aircraft rested, battered but intact, on a forgotten strip. The next steps would unfold outside the cockpit, as the doors opened and sunlight reached the faces of those who had waited for it. Emergency crews moved quickly around the aircraft, but Emily's attention stayed on the people who had shared the ordeal. She remained near the rear exit, guiding the last group of passengers out and checking the evacuation slide herself before stepping onto the uneven tarmac. The air outside felt colder than she expected. She paused, hands pressed to the fuselage, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. There was no dramatic collapse, just a moment to steady herself before moving on. A paramedic approached with questions, but Emily barely hesitated. She directed the medic straight to the co-pilot, relaying every observation she'd made during the descent pulse, breathing, skin color. Her focus never wavered from the immediate needs around her. Even as the commotion built and more responders arrived, she stayed in motion, passing out water bottles, helping the elderly to the triage area, returning a forgotten inhaler to a passenger who was near tears. She blended practical action with calm, never lingering long enough for anyone to thank her. Reporters gathered quickly, cameras and microphones angling for a statement. Emily sidestepped the attention, redirecting questions toward the crew and the captain. When pressed for a comment, she gave only brief, factual answers. The crew followed their training. The captain made the right calls. Everyone worked together. She refused to center herself in the story, keeping the spotlight on the collective effort rather than her own role. Inside the emergency tent, passengers shared fragments of what they'd witnessed. Some described Emily's steady voice as she guided them toward the exits, or the way she calmly pointed out the best path for those with mobility issues. Her leadership was quiet, almost invisible, a thread of composure running through the confusion. No one saw her raise her voice or take charge in a dramatic way. Instead, she filled gaps, offered direction, and stepped back as soon as the need passed. The airline's representatives wanted her at a press conference. Emily declined, suggesting the crew's training deserved the focus. When she finally agreed to a brief appearance, she wore borrowed scrubs and answered every hero question with technical details, throttle positions, checklists, the value of cross-checking instruments, never once mentioning fear or doubt. She kept her answers dry and operational, deflecting any attempt to turn her into the story. Emily's actions after the landing matched her response during the crisis, measured, focused, and always aimed at helping others first. She kept her distance from the media, quietly checked on the status of the co-pilot, and spent her remaining time at the airstrip, helping where she could. When a young mother approached to thank her, Emily shifted the conversation to the child's composure during evacuation, gently steering praise away from herself. A photographer tried to capture her in a moment of triumph, but the image that circulated later showed her turned away, offering a jacket to a shivering passenger while families reunited in the background. Her presence in the official incident report was buried in technical appendices, her name mentioned only in passing. The captain received a formal commendation. Emily accepted a handshake and a voucher for a hotel room, then faded into the crowd at baggage claim, politely insisting to anyone who asked that they had the wrong person. Later that night, she sat alone in her hotel room, watching muted news coverage. The footage replayed scenes of relief and reunion, the narrative focused on the captain's leadership and the crew's professionalism. Emily's name scrolled past only once. She ordered a simple meal, answered a few texts from close friends, and slept deeply for the first time in days. There was no applause, no headline moment. For Emily, the outcome was enough. The work was done, the passengers safe, and the story already shifting to others. As she prepared to return home, she carried the experience quietly, knowing that real impact rarely makes the news. Before moving on, consider this. How many quiet, capable people travel beside us every day, prepared to act when it matters whether we ever know their names or not? After the emergency landing, Emily Carter's next steps were quiet and deliberate. When the airline reached out to discuss compensation, she asked for something different: fund flight training for people who'd been told they didn't belong in the cockpit. That request became the Emily Carter Flight Academy Fund, launched with little fanfare and a modest budget. It started with 4 scholarships, each covering the full cost of a private pilot's license for someone who otherwise wouldn't have had the chance. Maria Gutierrez was among the first recipients. She had spent years washing Cessnas at a regional airport, saving every tip and hour of overtime, always hoping for a chance to fly. The fund changed her trajectory. Another recipient, James Wilson, grew up in foster care, sketching airplane designs in the margins of school notebooks. The selection process focused on persistence and need, not polished resumes or test scores. Emily reviewed the applications herself, marking technical notes in pencil and passing them on without fanfare. Aviation remains one of the least diverse STEM fields, with barriers that go beyond academics. Traditional scholarships often favor those with resources families who can afford instructor fees, medical exams, or even the commute to distant airfields. Emily's fund targeted these invisible costs, lowering the threshold for entry and making the path to a pilot's license possible for those who had been quietly excluded. Emily led by example, not by speechmaking. Her mentorship came through practical simulator sessions, walking trainees through system failures, slow leaks, and partial panel emergencies, always emphasizing that real crises rarely announce themselves with drama. She kept her presence low-key, standing at the edge of group photos or diagramming instrument scans on napkins if someone asked how she'd stayed calm under pressure. The impact grew gradually. Within 3 years, the fund supported a new wave of pilotsome, of whom went on to instruct others, creating a cycle of support that extended far beyond the original group. Among them was the program's first deaf pilot, who trained with visual instrument aids and later taught others in the same way. Aviation schools noted a visible change: more women, more students from rural backgrounds, and more first-generation flyers enrolling and graduating. At one school, staff only learned Emily was behind several anonymous scholarships when the checks cleared. Emily's approach to recognition stayed consistent. She attended fundraising events only when necessary, preferring to brief donors on technical outcomes rather than share personal anecdotes. She explained how each dollar translated into hours in the cockpit, focusing on the mechanics of opportunity rather than inspiration. Industry publications occasionally tried to profile her, but her answers remained factual, steering the conversation back to systems and safety. The ripple effect extended into classrooms and hangars. At a high school career fair, Emily spent most of her time explaining how elevator trim worked to a nervous sophomore, ignoring the student journalist hoping for a headline. When a social media post called her a badass pilot, she quietly replied to correct the record. She'd been a cadet, not an officer, and the work mattered more than the title. Institutional change followed. Training manuals added her annotated approach checklists as supplemental resources. Flight schools developed outreach programs modeled after her fund, some expanding their own scholarships for underrepresented groups. One of the earliest recipients, Maria, signed with a regional airline the same week the fund marked its 5th anniversary. She credited Emily not for a single act of heroism, but for showing up month after month, watching trainees struggle through approaches and offering corrections only when needed. Emily's influence never relied on public acclaim. She returned to her software job, her work badge unchanged, her name rarely mentioned outside technical reports. The fund continued to grow, not because of a charismatic leader, but because the structure she built worked quietly expanding access, one adjustment at a time. The effects of her choices echoed in small, persistent ways. In the confidence of a new pilot, in a revised checklist, in a classroom where a student first considered aviation possible. These ripples didn't seek attention. They simply continued, shaping the field from the inside out, evidence that real change, like real skill, often operates without spectacle. In the end, Emily's story set a different standard for what it means to lead. Heroism is often imagined as a single grand gesturea dramatic rescue, a speech, or a medal pinned to a uniform, but what happened on Flight 982 suggests something different. Emily Carter's actions did not fit the familiar script. She did not seek out the spotlight, and she never claimed the label of hero. Instead, her story challenges the idea that heroism is defined by spectacle or recognition. Her choices, made quietly and often unnoticed in the moment, forced a reconsideration of what it means to act bravely and well. What stands out about Emily's landing is how it unfolded, not as a single, sweeping act, but as a series of small, correct decisions. Each minor input and adjustment to the yoke, a careful check of the co-pilot's airway, a recalculation of descent stacked together until the outcome was survival. The sum of these choices, none extraordinary on its own, became the difference between disaster and a safe landing. Aviation experts reviewing the incident noted how her steady stream of corrections, made almost automatically, exemplified how distributed heroism works in real life. In crisis, it is rarely one act that saves the day, but the discipline to do the next right thing again and again. Emily's preparedness did not come from a desire for glory. Her Air Force training, though unused for years, had left her with a sense of duty and a set of skills that surfaced when needed. She had been told more than once that she was too quiet for command, too reserved for high-pressure work. Yet when the moment arrived, she drew on training that had become muscle memory. The ability to act decisively, even after years away from the cockpit, showed that real readiness is less about bravado and more about what endures beneath the surface. For many with military backgrounds, this approach feels familiar. Competence under pressure is not seen as exceptional, but as a baseline expectation. Emily's discomfort with praise after the landing reflected this mindset. She did not see herself as extraordinary. She saw herself as someone who did what was necessary, when it was necessary. The applause and headlines seemed almost beside the point compared to the satisfaction of a job done right. Leadership, too, took on a different shape in those hours. Emily did not seize command or issue orders. She assessed, supported, and filled in where needed. Her collaboration with Captain Doyle was defined by trust and mutual respect. She deferred to his experience when appropriate, offered her own expertise without demanding control, and focused on the shared goal of keeping everyone safe. This model of leadership rooted in adaptability and quiet competence contrasts with traditional images of authority, and it proved more effective in the chaos of the emergency. The same principle extends far beyond aviation. Crisis rarely announces itself with warning. People everywhere carry skills that remain hidden until circumstances demand them. The retired nurse performing an emergency tracheotomy in a grocery store, The engineer rerouting city buses during a blackout. These are not stories of fame, but of quiet competence rising to meet the moment. Emily's example shows that heroism is less about the headline and more about what happens when preparedness meets opportunity. After the landing, Emily's choices continued to redefine what it means to help. She focused on follow-through, reviewing procedures, assisting passengers, and ensuring no detail was missed. Her scholarship fund later embodied the same principle, supporting others not with grand gestures, but with sustained, practical help. The impact of these actions was lasting, even if it never made the news. What hidden competence lies dormant in the people around you? The answer may never be obvious, but its presence shapes outcomes in ways statistics will later reveal. In the world of commercial aviation, most flights pass without incident, yet every cabin holds people with skills and experience quietly waiting beneath the surface. Emily Carter's story is a reminder that real heroism often means responding to a challenge not with spectacle, but with steady preparation and clear thinking. She didn't change protocols or rewrite manuals, she simply applied her training when it mattered, showing that ordinary competence, when called upon, can have extraordinary results. The abandoned airstrip where Flight 982 landed now serves as a case study in pilot training, a testament to how everyday professionalism can shape outcomes. Quiet professionals like Emily keep aviation and life itself, not through applause, but through readiness and resolve. Have you ever witnessed or been part of a moment where ordinary skills made all the difference? Share your story in the comments below.